October 14, 1943. High above the sprawling industrialized heartland of the German Reich, the air grows thin and brutally cold. For the men of the United States 8th Air Force, it is a hostile, alien world, a stratosphere painted in the pale, unforgiving blue of extreme altitude. Below them lies the city of Schweinfurt, a name that has become an obsession for Allied war planners. This city is the circulatory system of the Nazi war machine, its factories producing nearly half of the ball bearings essential for every German tank, cannon, and aircraft. To strike Schweinfurt is to strike at the very sinews of the Third Reich. On this day, a mighty armada of 291 B-17 flying fortresses has been dispatched to do just that, a silver river of aluminum and ordnance flowing deep into enemy territory. They are the physical embodiment of a doctrine, that high-altitude, daylight, precision bombing can win the war. But this doctrine is about to be tested to its breaking point. The core of the Allied strategic problem, a problem that has bedeviled planners for months, was the tyranny of distance. The bombers did not fly alone, at least not at first. They were shepherded from their bases in England by the best fighters the Allies could field, the nimble British Spitfire and the rugged, powerful American P-47 Thunderbolt. Bomber crews called them their little friends, and for the first leg of the journey, the sky was a carefully choreographed ballet of heavy bombers and their guardian angels. But it was a fleeting security. One by one, as they crossed the European coast and pushed deeper inland, the little friends would wag their wings in a mournful farewell and peel away, their fuel gauges dictating a bitter retreat. They were tethered to home by an invisible leash, their combat radius defining the line between life and death for the bomber crews they were forced to abandon. For the German Luftwaffe, this was not a flaw in Allied strategy. It was the fundamental, unchangeable cornerstone of their entire defensive system. The German High Command, led by the supremely confident Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and orchestrated in the field by brilliant tacticians like Fighter General Adolf Galland, had built their entire aerial defense of the Reich upon one, simple, unshakable assumption, that no single-engine fighter could possibly possess the range to escort a bomber to a target deep within Germany and return. They believed it was a physical impossibility. Their intelligence confirmed it. The laws of aerodynamics and fuel consumption proved it. Therefore, the defense was layered. The outer fringes were a hornet's nest of agile Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s designed to harass and bleed the escorting fighters. But the real killing ground lay beyond, in the deep interior, where the bomber streams, now stripped of their protectors, would be met by the full, calculated fury of the Luftwaffe's Zerstörer, the heavy destroyer wings armed with rockets and heavy cannons specifically designed to tear the wings off a four-engine bomber. On this day, a day that would be forever burned into the collective memory of the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday, the German system worked with chilling, lethal precision. As the last of the P-47s turned for home, the German controllers vectored their squadrons toward the defenseless bomber stream. The attack was not a chaotic dogfight, it was a methodical, industrial slaughter. German pilots, freed from the threat of enemy fighters, pressed their attacks with unnerving discipline, flying in waves, making head-on passes where the B-17's defensive machine guns were weakest. For 3 horrific hours, the sky over Germany became a funeral pyre. Radio channels filled with the screams of dying men. 60 American bombers, each carrying a crew of 10, were blown from the sky. 600 men vanished in fireballs of smoke and shattered metal. Of the bombers that managed to limp back to England, nearly every single one was damaged, riddled with cannon holes, their crews wounded, exhausted, and psychologically broken. Black Thursday was more than a lost battle. It was the catastrophic failure of a strategy. It was brutal, undeniable proof that the Luftwaffe's confidence was justified and that the Allied bomber offensive, as it was currently conceived, was facing annihilation. The Allies needed a weapon that defied the enemy's logic, a fighter that could shatter the assumption that formed the very foundation of Germany's defense. They needed a machine that, according to the enemy, could not and did not exist. In the immediate chilling aftermath of the Schweinfurt raid, a profound and terrifying silence descended upon the Allied High Command. The strategic bombing campaign, which men like General Ira Eaker had championed as the swiftest path to victory, was now teetering on the edge of a bloody abyss. The brutal arithmetic of Black Thursday was undeniable. No air force on Earth could sustain such losses and remain a viable fighting force. The confidence of the Luftwaffe was not arrogance. It was a simple, correct assessment of the facts as they stood. The German defensive strategy, built entirely on the logistical certainty of limited fighter range, had been vindicated in the most spectacular and devastating way imaginable. The American 8th Air Force was being bled white, and the very future of the daylight bombing effort hung by a thread. A halt was called to all deep penetration raids, a quiet, implicit admission of a catastrophic failure. The enemy, it seemed, had presented a problem for which there was no solution. The search for an answer had become an obsession. The Allies were not without powerful weapons. The British Supermarine Spitfire was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, a purebred interceptor that had saved England in 1940. In a close-quarters dogfight, it was arguably the finest defensive fighter in the world. But it was a duelist's rapier, not a cavalryman's saber. Its notoriously short range, designed for defending the British Isles, made it utterly unsuitable for the long, arduous slog into Germany. The American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the polar opposite. It was a monster of an aircraft, built around the most powerful piston engine of the war, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. It was brutally tough, capable of absorbing astonishing punishment, and armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns that could shred anything that flew into its sights. But that colossal engine came at a cost, a ferocious, insatiable thirst for fuel. Even with external drop tanks, its reach was limited. It could punch its way to the German border, but it could not go the distance. There was another candidate, the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning. With two engines, it had the theoretical power and fuel capacity for long-range flight. Indeed, in the vast expanses of the Pacific theater, it was already proving itself a capable, long-legged killer. But over the frigid high-altitude skies of northern Europe, it was plagued by a host of debilitating technical problems. Its engines were susceptible to the extreme cold, and its cockpit heating was notoriously inadequate, turning the cabin into a frozen prison for its pilot. It was a partial answer, but it was not the silver bullet the bomber crews so desperately needed. The Allies were caught in a strategic trap. They had interceptors that couldn't reach, and long-range fighters that couldn't fight effectively where it mattered most. It appeared as if the Luftwaffe's core assumption was, in fact, an unbreakable law of nature. But in the background, a radical, almost heretical solution was beginning to take shape. It centered on an aircraft that, until now, had been considered a profound disappointment, the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally designed at the behest of the British Royal Air Force, the early Mustang was powered by an American Allison V-1710 engine. It was a decent performer at low altitudes, but as it climbed into the thin air where the bombers flew, its performance collapsed. The engine was, in simple terms, asthmatic. The aircraft was relegated to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, a useful but unremarkable machine. However, a brilliant spark of insight within the RAF saw the potential hidden within its advanced airframe. The British possessed the world's most sophisticated high-altitude engine, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin. The same engine that powered the Spitfire. The audacious, unprecedented idea was proposed, to perform a transatlantic heart transplant. To rip the inadequate Allison engine out of the American airframe and replace it with a British Merlin. This was the beginning of an alchemical transformation, a matrimony of British power and American design that would challenge the very foundations of German air supremacy. The proposal to merge a British engine with an American airframe was, on its face, an act of sheer desperation. In the rigid, nationalistic world of wartime aircraft development, such a hybrid was practically unheard of. But desperation breeds innovation. The spark was ignited not by a committee of generals, but by a single, observant pilot. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker, after flying an early Allison-powered Mustang, was simultaneously impressed by its sophisticated airframe and appalled by its high-altitude performance. He famously noted in a memorandum that the Mustang, with a proper engine, would be a world beater. It was this simple, direct observation that set in motion one of the most consequential technological collaborations of the Second World War. The solution to the Luftwaffe's dominance would not come from a single nation's genius, but from a brilliant, deadly synthesis of the best of both. The secret to the Mustang's potential lay hidden in its wings. Designed by a team at North American Aviation led by the brilliant Edgar Schmid, the P-51 possessed a revolutionary piece of aerodynamic technology, the laminar flow wing. In conventional aircraft wings of the era, the air flowing over the curved surface would quickly become turbulent, creating a significant amount of drag that limited speed and wasted fuel. The Mustang's wing, however, was designed with a unique airfoil shape that maintained smooth, or laminar, flow across a much greater portion of its surface. The result was a dramatic reduction in aerodynamic drag, a design so efficient it slipped through the air with unprecedented ease. This was the first pillar of the solution. Even with its flawed engine, the Mustang was a thoroughbred, an airframe waiting for a heart strong enough to match its potential. That heart was the Rolls-Royce Merlin 60 series engine. The Merlin was already a legend, the engine that had powered the Spitfires and Hurricanes to victory in the Battle of Britain. But its latest iteration was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, specifically designed for high-altitude combat. Its crucial advantage was a revolutionary two-stage, two-speed supercharger. A supercharger is essentially a compressor that forces more air into the engine, allowing it to maintain power in the thin atmosphere of high altitude. The Merlin's advanced system was like giving the engine a sophisticated set of mechanical lungs. As the fighter climbed, the supercharger would automatically shift gears, compressing the thin air and feeding the engine a dense, power-rich mixture. It allowed the Merlin to breathe, and therefore to fight, at altitudes above 30,000 feet, the very airspace where the Allison engine suffocated and died. This was the second pillar. The marriage of the two was an engineering marvel, accomplished with breathtaking speed. In a matter of months, engineers at Rolls-Royce's facility in Hucknall, England, had fitted the new Merlin into the Mustang airframe, creating the Mustang X prototypes. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The aircraft's top speed leaped by nearly 50 miles per hour. More critically, its performance at 30,000 feet, where the bombers flew, was utterly revolutionized. This new creation, officially designated the P-51 Mustang, was the perfect synthesis of British power and American design. But speed and altitude alone were not enough to solve the tyranny of distance. The final, war-winning element was its astonishing fuel capacity. The airframe was designed from the outset to hold a massive internal fuel load, far more than a Spitfire or a Bf-109. When combined with two external drop tanks, the Mustang became something the Luftwaffe High Command truly believed was impossible, a fighter that could not only match their own interceptors in a dogfight, but could do so over Berlin, and then fly all the way home. It was the weapon the enemy's entire strategy was predicated on not existing. And it was about to be unleashed. The arrival of the first P-51 Mustangs in England in late 1943 was not met with a triumphant, war-winning fanfare, but with a quiet, almost desperate sense of anticipation. They were a gamble, a hybrid machine born from a transatlantic crisis. The first unit to be fully equipped with this unknown quantity was the 354th Fighter Group of the 9th Air Force, a unit that would soon earn the moniker Pioneer Mustang Group. These were the men tasked with turning this promising but unproven aircraft into a weapon. Their commander was Colonel Don Blakesley, a hard-driving, aggressive combat leader who understood the brutal reality of the air war with absolute clarity. He knew that a new machine was worthless without a new way of thinking. For the pilots, their first encounters with the Mustang were a revelation. Accustomed to the sheer mass and brute force of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Mustang felt entirely different. It was a finely balanced, responsive thoroughbred, a pilot's aircraft that seemed to read its master's thoughts. However, this new weapon was not without its flaws. The early P-51B and C models were fitted with a razorback canopy, a framed enclosure that, while aerodynamically sound, created a terrifying blind spot directly to the rear. In the swirling, three-dimensional chaos of a dogfight, what a pilot couldn't see could kill him. Furthermore, the powerful Merlin engine, while a miracle at high altitude, was a complex and sometimes temperamental piece of machinery, prone to teething problems. But these issues paled in comparison to its one, transcendent quality, its incredible range. For the first time, Allied pilots had an aircraft that could not only fly to the heart of Germany, but could arrive there with enough fuel to fight aggressively for an extended period, and then return home. This single capability was poised to shatter the entire foundation of the German air defense strategy. The true revolution, however, was not merely technological. It was doctrinal. In early 1944, a change in command at the 8th Air Force brought in General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a man forever immortalized by his daring raid on Tokyo. Doolittle was an innovator, an officer who despised rigid, defensive thinking. He saw the Mustang not just as a shield for the bombers, but as a sword. He immediately rescinded the standing order that had kept escort fighters shackled to the slow-moving bomber formations. His new directive was a model of brutal simplicity. The fighters were to go out ahead of the bombers and hunt. They were to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, on the ground, during takeoff, and in the skies. He had effectively unleashed the Hounds. This was a fundamental rewriting of the rules of aerial combat, and for the Luftwaffe, it was a source of profound and immediate bewilderment. Their pilots, accustomed to engaging lumbering, unescorted bombers deep inside the Reich, were suddenly ambushed by swarms of aggressive high-performance fighters in their own backyard. The initial German reaction was one of complete disbelief. Their intelligence services had no record of such a long-range Allied fighter. It simply wasn't possible. Luftwaffe pilots initially reported engaging P-47s, assuming the American pilots were on one-way suicide missions, or that they had developed some impossibly large external fuel tank that would severely degrade their performance. Their rigid adherence to their own established truths blinded them to the reality of the situation. They were facing an enemy who had not just built a better machine, but who had fundamentally changed the game. The stage was now set for the Mustang to transition from a promising newcomer to the most feared and dominant aerial weapon in the European theater of operations. The legend of the P-51 Mustang is invariably written in the sky, a saga of ace pilots and dramatic dogfights. But the machine's revolutionary impact, its ability to systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe, was not forged in the cold blue of the stratosphere alone. Its true foundation was built on the ground, in the sprawling, muddy, and perpetually damp airfields of eastern England. It was here that an unseen army of men, the ground crews, waged a relentless 24-hour war against friction, fatigue, and the unforgiving English weather. They were the armorers, the mechanics, the electricians, and the refuelers, and they were the secret weapon that the German High Command, in its focus on aircraft performance specifications, completely failed to account for. The secret weapon wasn't just a plane. It was the colossal human engine of maintenance and logistics that put it in the air, day after day. Life on a forward airbase like RAF Leiston or Debden was a world away from the clean rooms and orderly factories where the Mustang was born. It was a world of Nissen huts, of cold steel tools that numbed the fingers, and of an ever-present, clinging mud that seemed to swallow everything. For these men, the war was an endless cycle of grueling, meticulous labor, performed under immense pressure. The heart of their struggle was the Mustang's greatest asset and its most demanding master, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This was not a simple, ruggedized motor designed for ease of maintenance. It was a high-performance, thoroughbred racing engine, a complex symphony of thousands of precisely machined parts, and it demanded constant, expert attention. Every time a Mustang returned from a mission, the work began. The engine cowlings would come off, and the crew chiefs, men with an almost mystical connection to their specific aircraft, would begin their rituals. They were listening for the subtle change in engine rhythm that might signal a worn bearing, checking the intricate network of coolant and oil lines for the smallest leak, and painstakingly changing out the Merlin's 24 spark plugs, a frustrating, knuckle-scraping job in the cold. They understood that a single fouled plug or a microscopic fracture in a glycol hose could, 6 miles above Germany, lead to catastrophic engine failure and the death of their pilot. This was the unseen umbilical cord connecting the mud of England to the skies over Berlin. While the mechanics wrestled with the Merlin, the armorers performed their own brutal ballet. They loaded the Mustang's 6.50 caliber machine guns, feeding thousands of rounds of ammunition into the wing bays, ensuring each belt was perfectly seated, a task that required both strength and precision. A single jammed gun could be a death sentence in a dogfight. Simultaneously, the refuelers would be pumping hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel into the internal tanks and the crucial external drop tanks. It was a river of grit, oil, and determination. This colossal round-the-clock effort ensured that when the dawn call came, a squadron of perfectly tuned, fully armed, and completely fueled killing machines would be ready, their Merlin engines roaring to life in a deafening chorus that was the sound of Allied resolve. The Luftwaffe pilots saw only the finished product, a deadly fighter appearing out of the sun. They could not see the frozen hands, the sleepless nights, and the sheer, bloody-minded persistence of the thousands of men on the ground who made that sudden, shocking appearance possible. The bitter winter of early 1944 was a period of tense, coiled spring anticipation. While the ground crews had been mastering the Merlin engine, the strategic planners of the Allied air forces were preparing a calculated, brutal gambit. They were going to send the bombers back to the heart of the Reich, but this time, it would be different. The target was not ball bearings, but the Luftwaffe itself. The plan was code-named Operation Argument, but history would remember it by a simpler, more powerful name, Big Week. From February 20th to the 25th, the 8th Air Force, in concert with the 15th Air Force flying from Italy, would launch a sustained, overwhelming assault on the German aircraft industry, hitting the factories that built the FW190s and Bf109s. It was a direct challenge, a gauntlet thrown down into the enemy's heartland, and the P-51 Mustang was the instrument that made the entire, audacious operation possible. As the massive formations took to the air, a silver tide of unprecedented scale, the fundamental shift in Allied capability was immediately apparent. On previous deep penetration raids, the bomber crews had watched with growing anxiety as their little friends turned for home. But now, as the P-47s reached the limit of their endurance and peeled away, a new shape, sleek and predatory, took their place. The Mustangs were there. And they stayed. For the bomber crews, seeing those fighters hold their position as they crossed the invisible line where before they had been left alone was a moment of profound, almost spiritual relief. The psychological impact was immense. But for the German High Command, it was the beginning of a strategic catastrophe that would unfold in slow, agonizing disbelief. The initial reports that filtered into Luftwaffe command posts were treated as errors, as pilot hysteria. German radar operators, tracking the incoming raids, began to see something that their training and their doctrine told them was impossible. Single-engine fighter signatures that did not turn back. They remained with the bombers, pushing deeper and deeper into the Reich's airspace. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. The controller's entire operational calculus was based on the free fire zone that existed beyond the range of Allied escorts. That zone had now vanished. When the German interceptors rose to meet the bombers, they did not find lumbering, defenseless targets. Instead, they flew headfirst into a whirlwind of .50 caliber machine gun fire from squadrons of P-51s that had been waiting for them. This was the masterstroke of Doolittle's new doctrine. The Mustangs were not merely a passive shield, they were an offensive spearhead. They roamed ahead of the bomber streams, pouncing on German fighters as they were still trying to form up. The results were devastating. The Luftwaffe pilots were utterly baffled. Their tactics, perfected over months against unescorted bombers, were now suicidal. A head-on pass, once a preferred tactic, was now an invitation to be shredded by an unseen Mustang diving from above. Over the course of Big Week, the Allied air forces shattered the German aircraft industry on the ground, but more importantly, they began to systematically annihilate the Luftwaffe in the air. Hundreds of German fighters were shot down. The most crippling blow was not to the machines, but to the men. The Luftwaffe lost a catastrophic number of its most experienced and skilled veteran pilots, the very core of its fighting force. These were men who could not be replaced. Their entire defensive doctrine, a complex and rigid edifice built on a single, flawed assumption, began to crumble in a matter of hours. The impossible fighter had arrived, and with it, it brought the beginning of the end for the German Air Force. Inside the cavernous, smoke-filled command bunkers of the Reich Air Ministry, the initial reports from Big Week were met not with panic, but with a profound and rigid sense of denial. The teletypes chattered with frantic messages from frontline fighter wings, reporting massive formations of American bombers deep inside Germany, escorted by swarms of single-engine fighters. The reports were dismissed. They had to be. Senior Luftwaffe officers, men who had built their careers on the precise, mathematical application of air power, cross-referenced the sighting locations with the known combat radii of Allied aircraft. The numbers did not compute. It was a logical impossibility. The initial explanation, therefore, was that the bomber crews were misidentifying long-range P-38 Lightnings or that overeager German pilots were exaggerating the scale of the escort. It was a comfortable, self-assured delusion, the last gasp of a strategy that was already dead. This denial quickly curdled into a state of intellectual paralysis. The problem of the Mustang was not simply a new piece of enemy hardware to be countered. It was a phantom that defied the fundamental physics of their war. It was a crisis of faith. Reich's Marshal Göring, who had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, was said to have flown into a volcanic rage, accusing his own fighter pilots of cowardice. He could not accept that the enemy had created a weapon his own intelligence services had deemed impossible. General Adolf Galland, the respected and clear-eyed commander of the day fighters, knew better. He understood that the frantic reports from his embattled pilots were not fantasy. He was witnessing the systematic demolition of his entire defensive structure, and the source of this profound bewilderment was an aircraft he had never been warned about. The Luftwaffe's desperate search for an explanation became a study in strategic delusion. They theorized that the Allies must be using secret, forward airfields hidden in occupied territory. This was investigated and found to be false. They speculated that the Americans had developed some radical new fuel that dramatically extended range. This too was a fantasy. The truth was so much simpler, and so much more damning. The enemy had simply built a better airplane. They had combined a superior airframe with a superior engine and a superior fuel capacity. The German High Command was so trapped by its own assumptions, so confident in its own technological supremacy, that it was intellectually incapable of grasping this reality. Their entire model of the air war was shattered, and they had nothing to replace it with. For the individual German pilot, this intellectual crisis in the High Command translated into a new and terrifying reality in the cockpit. The skies over his homeland, once the exclusive hunting ground of the Jagdwaffe, had become the most dangerous place on Earth. A pilot taking off from a base near Berlin to intercept a bomber stream no longer had the luxury of a planned, coordinated attack. He was now the prey. The Mustangs would be waiting, diving out of the sun, their silver fuselages almost invisible against the glare. The brilliant, deadly dance of aerial combat had changed its tune overnight. The German veterans, the battle-hardened experten with scores of victories, were now forced into desperate, defensive fights for their own lives against an enemy that was their equal in speed and their superior in numbers. The confidence that had defined the Luftwaffe pilot in 1943 was replaced by a gnawing, ever-present fear in 1944. The hunters had become the hunted, a psychological reversal from which the German fighter arm would never recover. The P-51 Mustang had become more than a machine of war, it was a weapon of profound psychological shock. With the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy shattered and its command structure in a state of intellectual chaos, the air war over Germany transformed. It ceased to be a series of calculated, strategic engagements and became a relentless, one-sided hunt. The instrument of this hunt was the P-51 Mustang, but the soul of the hunt, its driving, aggressive heart, was the American fighter pilot. The Mustang did not just create a technological advantage, it forged a new breed of warrior, a new kind of aerial predator, supremely confident and utterly lethal. These were the knights of this new aerial chivalry, the aces, whose names would become legend back home and a whispered curse in the ready rooms of the German Jagdwaffe. Men like Captain Don Gentile and his wingman Captain John Godfrey of the illustrious 4th Fighter Group became the living embodiment of this new reality. Flying from RAF Debden, Gentile and Godfrey pursued the enemy with a relentless, almost joyful aggression. They were the ultimate expression of Doolittle's "Unleash the Hounds" directive. They would race far ahead of the bomber streams, deliberately seeking out the massive German fighter formations, plunging into them in a furious, coordinated assault. Their teamwork was legendary, a brilliant dance where each pilot instinctively knew the other's moves, covering his partner's tail while lining up their own victim. For them, the Mustang was a perfect extension of their own will, a machine that could climb, dive, and turn with a ferocity that allowed them to dictate the terms of every single engagement. This newfound power created a profound psychological shift in the American pilots. The grim, defensive anxiety that had characterized the early escort missions was gone, replaced by an aggressive, forward-leaning swagger. They knew, with absolute certainty, that they were flying the finest piston-engine fighter in the world. Pilots like Major Clarence "Bud" Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group, the famed Yoxford Boys, spoke of the Mustang with a reverence usually reserved for a living thing. Anderson, in his iconic P-51 Old Crow, knew that he could outclimb, outrun, and outlast any German opponent he faced. He could engage a Messerschmitt 109 in a high-altitude turning fight or dive away from a Focke-Wulf 190, knowing the Mustang's superior aerodynamics gave him the ultimate trump card, the power to choose when and where to fight. This was a luxury the German pilots no longer had. The once dominant Experten were being systematically eliminated, and their replacements were young, hastily trained pilots with only a few dozen hours of flight time. They were lambs being sent to the slaughter. Thrown into the sky in technologically inferior aircraft, they were met by packs of American veterans flying a superior machine. The combat reports of the American aces tell a chillingly repetitive story. A German fighter spotted, a dive from altitude, a long burst of .50 caliber fire, and a blossoming orange fireball against the clouds. What was a moment of triumphant victory for a pilot like Gentile was, for the Luftwaffe, another irreplaceable veteran lost, another hole torn in the fabric of their rapidly disintegrating air force. The P-51 Mustang had not only given the Allies control of the sky, it had turned that sky into a one-sided killing field, ensuring that when the Allies finally stormed the beaches of Normandy, they would do so under a sky that was, for all intents and purposes, their own. June 6, 1944. On the windswept, blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, the German soldier peers anxiously at the sky. He is surrounded by the deafening, earth-shaking thunder of Allied naval guns, the crack of rifles, and the screams of his comrades. But as he looks up, past the smoke and the chaos, he is met with a terrifying, unnatural silence. The sky is empty. Where are the Stukas? Where are the Messerschmitts? Where is the Luftwaffe? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man tasked with defending Fortress Europe, had based his entire defensive strategy on a single critical assumption, that his elite panzer divisions, held in reserve, would be able to race to the coastline and annihilate the Allied beachhead before it could be properly established. This rapid, armored counterattack was the linchpin of the German plan. And that plan was predicated on the Luftwaffe providing at least some measure of air cover. It was a fatal miscalculation, a complete failure to comprehend the brutal new reality of the air war. The clear skies over Normandy were not an accident of fate. They were a hard-won, deliberately engineered vacuum, created over the preceding 4 months by the relentless destruction of the German Air Force. Every dogfight over Berlin, every strafing run on a German airfield, every shattered Messerschmitt spiraling into the ground during Big Week, had been a preparatory act for this very day. The P-51 Mustang, the weapon that had first saved the bomber offensive, had now become the ultimate enabler of the ground invasion. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had been promised air supremacy for the invasion. What the pilots of the 8th and 9th Air Forces delivered was something far more profound: absolute air dominance. On D-Day, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, in stark, pathetic contrast, managed fewer than 300, most of which were ineffective and suicidal. The Mustang's role on this day was no longer that of a high-altitude guardian. It had descended from the stratosphere to become a low-level predator. Flying in endless cab-rank patrols, squadrons of P-51s, now also configured as potent fighter bombers armed with bombs and rockets, formed a steel umbrella over the invasion force. But for the German army, it was a reign of terror. The German soldiers even had a name for it: Jabberskreck, the fighter-bomber terror. Any German unit that dared to move during daylight was instantly set upon by roving packs of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Rommel's panzers, the iron fist that was supposed to drive the Allies back into the sea, were paralyzed. A German tank commander attempting to move his unit from reserve to the front lines found himself in an impossible situation. The moment his column of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks appeared on a French road, it was spotted. Within minutes, a flight of Mustangs would appear as if from nowhere, diving with a terrifying shriek, their .50 caliber machine guns ripping through the thin-skinned supply trucks and their rockets smashing into the panzers themselves. Bridges were destroyed, railway lines were cut, and entire armored columns were left as smoldering, twisted pyres of wreckage. The German army in Normandy was blinded, isolated, and being systematically dismembered from the air. The baffled enemy was no longer just in the air. It was now every German soldier on the ground, staring helplessly at a sky that belonged completely to his foe. By the autumn of 1944, the P-51 Mustang had achieved a level of mastery over the skies of Europe so complete that it seemed unchallengeable. The Luftwaffe was a shattered remnant of its former self. Yet, just as victory appeared absolute, a new and terrifying shape began to slice through the high-altitude formations, a machine that moved with an otherworldly speed, trailing no visible propeller, only a faint, ominous whisper of smoke. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. For Allied pilots, the first encounter was a moment of profound shock. It was a shark appearing in a pond of minnows, an aircraft that could accelerate and climb in a way that seemed to defy the known laws of flight. It was Germany's last, desperate technological gamble, a wonder weapon that promised to sweep the Allied fighters from the sky. Faced with this futuristic threat, the Americans responded not with a new aircraft, but with the ultimate refinement of their existing masterpiece. The definitive version of the Mustang, the P-51D, had begun arriving in squadrons. Its primary innovation was not in speed or firepower, but in vision. The problematic razorback fuselage of the earlier models was cut down and replaced with a single, elegant, teardrop-shaped plexiglass bubble canopy. This seemingly simple change was a combat revelation. It eliminated the deadly rear blind spot, granting the pilot a panoramic, 360-degree view of the sky. A pilot could now check his 6 with a mere glance over his shoulder. In the swirling, multi-dimensional melee of a dogfight, the ability to see was the ability to live. The P-51D was the Mustang perfected, a machine that now combined breathtaking performance with unparalleled situational awareness. The Me-262, however, presented a terrifying new problem that vision alone could not solve. It was brutally, shockingly fast, over 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D in level flight. The German jet pilots, many of them the last surviving elite Experten like Adolf Galland himself, were supremely confident. They believed their technological superiority was absolute. In a straight race it was. They could engage and disengage at will, making a single, devastating firing pass with their 430mm cannons and then vanishing with a burst of speed that no propeller-driven fighter could possibly match. The enemy, it seemed, had once again created a weapon that should have made the Mustang obsolete. But the Mustang pilots, now masters of their craft, refused to be outmaneuvered. They couldn't outrun the jet, so they would have to outthink it. An entirely new set of tactics was developed, born from the hard-won experience of 1,000 dogfights. The solution was not to fight the Me-262 on its own terms, but to exploit its hidden weaknesses with patience and predatory cunning. Mustang squadrons began flying their patrols at much higher altitudes, orbiting like hawks far above the expected operational ceiling of the jets. From this perch, they could watch and wait. When a 262 was spotted below, the Mustangs would perform a high-side pass, nosing over into a steep, high-speed dive. By converting their altitude advantage into raw kinetic energy, they could build up enough speed to match the jet for a few fleeting seconds, just long enough to get a firing solution. More critically, the American pilots learned that the revolutionary jet engines of the Me-262 were also its Achilles heel. They were fragile and slow to respond. If a German pilot moved his throttle too quickly, the engines could flood with fuel and flame out. This meant the jets had poor acceleration and were dangerously sluggish during their long, vulnerable takeoff and landing runs. This was the weakness the Mustang pilots exploited with merciless ingenuity. They turned the German jet airfields into permanent killing zones. Squadrons of P-51s would loiter for hours, circling patiently miles away, waiting for the jets to return to base, low on fuel, flaps down, gear down. In that final, vulnerable moment of landing, the Mustangs would descend like wolves on a wounded animal. The German pilots, their technological miracle now a slow-moving target, were utterly helpless. The very weapon that was meant to be their salvation was instead being systematically exterminated, not by a superior technology, but by the superior tactical brilliance of the men flying the perfect piston-engine fighter. While the skies over Germany were being swept clean by the silver-winged hunters of the 8th Air Force, a second, even more profound drama of distance and attrition was unfolding half a world away. In the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the United States was deploying its ultimate weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. These were the most technologically advanced aircraft of the war, silver giants with pressurized cabins and computer-assisted gunnery systems, designed to fly higher and farther than any bomber ever conceived. From newly captured airfields in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they began a relentless aerial assault on the Japanese homeland. But once again, the Allies found themselves confronting the same brutal problem that had nearly broken them over Schweinfurt, the tyranny of distance. The flight from the Marianas to Tokyo was a grueling, 1,500-mile journey, almost entirely over a lonely, terrifying void of open water. The Japanese military, despite the crushing defeats it had suffered across the Pacific, remained supremely confident in the defense of its sacred home islands. Their strategy, much like the Germans before them, was built on the unshakable belief that no Allied fighter could possibly escort a bomber across such an impossible expanse of ocean. It was a mathematical certainty. And so, as the unescorted B-29s, flying at the absolute limit of their range, approached the Japanese coast, they were met by a wave of desperate and skilled interceptors. Fighters like the agile Kawasaki Ki-61 and the high-altitude Nakajima Ki-84 swarmed the bomber formations, pressing their attacks with suicidal ferocity. The losses for the B-29s began to mount at an alarming rate. The most expensive and sophisticated weapon in the American arsenal was being bled, and the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japan was in jeopardy. The solution was as audacious as it was bloody: the invasion of a tiny volcanic rock located halfway between the Marianas and Japan, an island called Iwo Jima. The sole purpose of capturing this heavily defended fortress was to turn it into an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a forward airfield for the one fighter in the Allied arsenal that had the legs for the mission. In March 1945, the P-51D Mustangs of the 7 Fighter Command arrived. The logistical feat was monumental, but the strategic imperative was absolute. On April 7, 1945, the first Very Long Range, or VLR, escort mission was launched. 108 Mustangs took off from the black sands of Iwo Jima, their engines straining, to meet the B-29s en route to Tokyo. For the Japanese air defense controllers, the appearance of fighter signatures alongside the bombers on their radar screens was a moment of sheer, unadulterated shock. It was a ghost from their German allies' past, a strategic impossibility made real. For the Japanese pilots who rose to meet the raid, the sight of swarms of silver Mustangs diving on them over their own capital city was a source of utter disbelief and tactical collapse. They were prepared for lumbering bombers, not for a swirling, high-altitude dogfight against the world's premier propeller-driven fighter. The result was a brutal and decisive replay of the air war over Germany. The Mustangs savaged the Japanese interceptors. B-29 losses plummeted overnight. With the Mustang now guaranteeing control of the sky, the American commander, General Curtis LeMay, was free to unleash the full, terrifying potential of his B-29 force. The Mustangs swept the skies clear, allowing the superfortresses to descend to low altitude and begin their devastating firebombing campaign, which would cripple Japanese industry and bring the nation to its knees. The P-51, a fighter born from a crisis over Germany, had proven its universal genius. It had solved the tyranny of distance not once, but twice, on opposite sides of the globe, against 2 different enemies who were both utterly baffled by its very existence. It was the key that unlocked the air, wherever it flew. When the final sputtering surrender of the Axis powers brought the Second World War to its conclusion, the silence that fell over the world's battlefields was mirrored by a profound technological shift. The thunderous roar of the piston engine, the defining sound of aerial combat for 3 decades, was already being eclipsed by the high-pitched scream of the jet. The future had arrived. But in that fleeting, pivotal moment, as one era gave way to the next, it was possible to look back and identify a single machine that represented the absolute, unequivocal apex of what had come before. The North American P-51 Mustang was not just another successful aircraft. It was the ultimate, perfected expression of the piston engine fighter, a weapon that achieved a more decisive strategic victory than any other combat plane of the war. Its legacy is not written merely in the tally of enemy aircraft destroyed, though that number is staggering. Its true, monumental impact lies in the problems it solved and the assumptions it shattered. It was the weapon that broke the tyranny of distance. Twice. In Europe, it saved the American daylight bombing campaign from catastrophic failure, transforming it from a bloody, unsustainable gamble into a relentless, war-winning sledgehammer. It systematically dismantled the German Luftwaffe, a force that had been built on the supremely confident and entirely logical belief that its heartland was unreachable. The Mustang made it reachable. And in doing so, it cleared the skies for the invasion of Normandy. In the Pacific, it performed the same miracle across an even more impossible void of open ocean. It enabled the B-29 superfortress to prosecute its campaign against the Japanese home islands, shattering the final, desperate defensive strategy of an enemy who believed, with equal certainty, in their geographic immunity. For both the German and Japanese high commands, the Mustang was more than a weapon. It was a source of profound bewilderment, a phantom that defied their logic, their intelligence, and their understanding of the laws of physics. It was the machine that proved their most fundamental strategic assumptions were fatally, catastrophically wrong. Other aircraft may have excelled in a single dimension. The Supermarine Spitfire was perhaps a purer dogfighter. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a fearsome interceptor. But no other aircraft combined all the essential elements of a truly great fighter into one, perfectly balanced, war-winning package. The Mustang had the speed, the altitude, the firepower, and the maneuverability to match or best any opponent it faced. But it was its incredible, uncompromised range that elevated it from a mere tactical weapon into an instrument of grand strategy. It did not just win battles, it won the air war itself. It was the product of a perfect synthesis, a revolutionary American airframe, a legendary British engine, and the tactical brilliance of the pilots who flew it. In the final analysis, the best fighter is the one that allows you to take the fight to the enemy, wherever he may be. By that measure, the P-51 Mustang stands alone. It was, and forever remains, the perfect piston engine fighter.